guys, welcome to this week's edition of Chewing the Fat. This week we have a great conversation with Dean and one of the consultants to Simplr Health, a microbiologist by the name of John Ellerman. Let's catch up with them both now and see what's happening in the world of microbiology.
Welcome, John Ellerman, consulting microbiologist to Simplr Health. Really excited to have you on this little Zoom chat with me, mate.
No problem.
Good to catch up, and you've grown some facial hair.
Yeah, that's right. I was hoping I could sort of find some follicles up here to pull it up.
Mate, I grew a facial hair once. Plucked it out in my 30s.
Your genes don't help.
Mate, I really wanted to get you on one of these chats and introduce you to the people that I work with and the people who observe the videos for Simplr Health, Trevor and I, and just for everybody else's understanding, I have an expert panel of clinicians and scientists, and John Ellerman, microbiologist, is one of my consulting experts in the area of microbiology and specifically gut health, which, we'll get into that in a moment. Just to let people know that you're someone that I turn to a lot. I hope I don't annoy you too much every time I call and with my questions.
No problem.
Excellent.
Fire away. What do you want to know?
Look, mate, this is just a bit of a chat. It'd be great for people to kind of better understand a little bit about who you are. What is a microbiologist? How the heck did you get to where you're at your point of your career?
Okay. My wife and I are both microbiologists. We studied together at the University of Sydney. She ended up a medical microbiologist, and I ended up a dairy microbiologist, which led me into the dairy culture industry. So I worked for most of my career for a company that was producing cultures for the dairy industry, the frozen concentrates and freeze-dried direct to the vat products. And I had a team under me of about 20 scientists and technicians, quite a few PhDs in there. And we had some of my team were on site at the University of New South Wales because that was a better environment for molecular biologists to work in. And they were doing research, of course, into the lactic acid bacteria and the genetics thereof. And because of that association, Professor Noel Dunn applied for and was successful in obtaining funding from the government for a cooperative research centre, and a major program in that cooperative research centre was probiotics and prebiotics. And so that was about developing the best possible strains of probiotics that are the most effective, and also pairing them with prebiotics that boosted their numbers exceptionally on the way down the tract. And we were particularly blessed to have several scientists from CSIRO as part of that group. And I was on the management committee, and we came up with some really good strains that have been commercialized since then. And about 17 years ago, I branched out into setting up my own business and manufactured synbiotics with a synergistic effect between the pro and the prebiotics. And we market those under several brands, and other people market them under their brands for us. And so that's the history. Today, the business is quite successful.
Yeah.
And
I mean, very topical area. Everyone's kind of talking about gut health and how it's all in the gut, and, interact with people who, everything from, the CEO and founder of Progenibiome, Dr. Sabine Hazan-Steinberg, who's in California. And she's done some amazing work around, she's a gastroenterologist and done some incredible work there, looking at the gut microbiome, even in COVID-19 infected patients, autism, all these areas. We'll get into those topics in a moment, but all the way down through to people who, you mentioned gut health. And I think it's so much common knowledge now. People go, oh yeah, it's like, it's so important. We've got to look after our gut health, but no one really understands what that means. Even when I say, look, and I'm a trained microbiologist as well, in a past lifetime ago, but I, given the little bit I know about microbiology, and I talk to you, and I just realize how damn complicated it really is, with the various algorithms required to better understand the complex combination of different bugs and the way in which they interact together, and then how that influences our physiology dependent on the nutritional environment as well. I mean, how do you make sense of all these variables and
your genetic environment as well.
The genetic, exactly, yeah.
And so they're all interacting, and there are thousands of PhDs that will yet be scored or won sorting these things out, and it is so complicated that most of the advancements at my level come from almost sealing wax and string sort of approach and suck it and see, because everybody is different. And the only way you can find out what's going to work for a person is to try it. And so, yeah, it doesn't require any great research to try things. And if the person responds appropriately, physiologically, and says, yeah, well, I feel better, you're on the right track. But even having said that, the thing that occupies a lot of my thinking is the role of the immune system. And I'm not an immunologist, and I find immunology frightfully complicated, and how the immune system interacts with the bacteria, how it also responds to bacteria that are translocating into the bloodstream. I mean, it's interacting with the bacteria in the intestinal lumen, and then it's coping with bacteria that translocate through a damaged intestinal wall. So much of this has been caused by antibiotics, of course. And then how do you get the immune system to forget to react to certain things like certain foods and other antigens on bacteria that have gone across and caused autoimmune diseases? It's one thing to reverse the dysbiosis, the too many bad bugs and not enough good ones, and we do that on a regular basis, and we can watch the gut heal, and that's the first step to seal up that intestinal wall. But then if the immune system has remembered that it's reacted to various things that person has eaten, or there's antibodies still running around in their system that are causing arthritis or Hashimoto's thyroiditis or any one of the 110 different autoimmune diseases, and that number's increasing all the time, how do you get it to stop reacting like that? And that's the biggest problem I've got, and perhaps you could get an immunologist on your team, and maybe you've got one.
Not yet. I did have a clinician with an interest, a specialist interest in immunology, but they're few and far between.
Yes, that's right. And I get the feeling that with some of them that they don't even know how to do what I'm talking about anyway.
Yes.
They are well versed in all the mechanisms involved in producing various cells and antibodies and so on, and that's all very well, but how to reverse an immune reaction situation is quite difficult, and I don't know that anyone really knows how to do it, because if you had measles when you were young, like I did, then those antibodies hang around in the system for years and years. And maybe they all get used up at some stage, but certainly the cells that produce those antibodies, you only need one of those in your system to be there ready to react again. So it becomes very difficult. And as Professor Tom Borody said to me some years ago, you know, when you swallow something that your immune system has already identified as problematic, then your stomach sends 20 chemical messengers down the gastrointestinal tract, basically saying, look out, here it comes. How you stop that happening, I do not know. And the other thing that bothers me is the immune system learns in your first year or two of life to tolerate and support the set of bugs that you got from mum and the early environment. And because the immune system assumes that, well, mum made it till childbearing age, so her set of bugs must be pretty good. We'll look after that set and we'll stop anything else that tries to get in. And that's why you can get over a salmonella infection. But when you have antibiotics and you wipe out those strains that were specifically being looked after by the immune system, how do you get them back in again? Because a distantly related strain of the same species is not close enough to make it back through that gatekeeper. So you end up with a more and more depleted microbiome.
Do you think we should be, before say 10 months of age, should we be taking poo samples from babies and storing them for later use?
That's an excellent idea. You know,
I think that's way more valuable and be way more cost effective than storing cord blood.
Yes, I agree. And you make what Tom Borody calls crapsules out of them. You can take them at a later stage and replenish your microbiome. I think that's an excellent idea. Of course, it's too late for you and for me. But we've got to, if someone could work out how to deprogram the immune system and then reprogram it on a set of bugs, the ideal microbiome set of bugs, if such a thing exists. I'm sure it does, but there'll be a whole range of different combinations that are acceptable. Then I think you've solved the biggest problem.
Yeah,
basically.
Yeah, I mean, Tom, it'd be fascinating for me to work with someone like him, you know, one of these gastroenterologists that has a special interest in the gut microbiome and how to correct it. Because, you know, I look at the results that I get with, you know, through metabolic reprogramming. People, I work with them, they lose weight, their health restores, so many different aspects of their health and well-being improves. And even clients who have had food intolerances prior to meeting with me, and then they go through this process of getting well, and then they can tolerate those foods again. And also people with autoimmune conditions, I'm seeing vast improvements. Even when measured, you know, we look at their inflammatory markers and it's almost like the whole thing's been reversed. And it's suspected that's probably a large part of that is because we're kind of reconstituting to whatever degree the gut microbiome somehow.
Yes, that's true. I mean, my inflammatory markers are particularly low, as you have observed.
Yes.
I often quote you, actually, Dean, that you said that my inflammatory markers were incredibly low for somebody as obese as me. So,
well, I'm determined. I'm going to sort that out one day, John.
I know you've got the answers. It's just that, you know, the whole exercise becomes very boring after a while, doesn't it?
It can do.
Anyway,
it can do.
Tom Borody. Again, he's very much a suck it and see kind of clinician based on what he understands, of course. But, well, I don't want to underestimate what he's achieved, of course, because he's achieved a tremendous amount.
There's still a lot more to go.
A lot more to go, that's right.
Yeah.
But look, just giving people our probiotic product, our symbiotic product, does do a lot to improve symptoms. And I have had people say that their autoimmune conditions have reversed, but typically what happens with food sensitivities is that they feel so much better that then they go and binge on the particular food they were previously sensitive to, and then they'll collapse in a heap, because you need to gradually build up to that sort of thing. So it's not straightforward, but what I say to people is start low on our product and work up, because the other thing that you see quite often with any good, really good probiotic product is that you get this, is it a Herxheimer reaction or, healing crisis, whatever you want to call it. And that's when I say to people with our product, don't jump in at the deep end, do it, build up gradually. And it usually takes them about 2 weeks. One woman, it took a month to get through, but she got through. And then they can tolerate high doses of our product and get on top of the situation. But there's always that transitional period.
Yes. And I take that that probiotic, that symbiotic myself daily. Even when I work with people, they lose the weight, they get well, and now they're in the stabilization phase. They're asking me, do we still need to take the supplements, etc.? I tell them, listen, you should be able to get most of everything that you need from the whole foods. Some people, I'd like to keep them on a potent multi. I still take a potent multivitamin mineral supplement, depending on my activity levels and how I've been looking after myself. I know my signal to noise ratio is pretty good now. So the background noise is pretty low. I'm pretty aware of my biological signals, and I have a relatively good understanding of what they mean. The one product that I just take every day, no matter what, is the probiotic, and I know when I go a few days not taking it, I feel it. It has an effect on me. Interestingly, I get, when I don't take it, I get eczema. Right? And my lower limbs, they start itching and so forth. I'll take the probiotic. Within a couple of days, that's all gone again.
Yes, that's right. The asthma, hay fever, eczema trilogy, if you've got a gene for that, and I have, I assume it's a gene because I'm allergic to house dust mites and used to have to leave the house if my wife vacuumed. But on this product, if I keep taking it, I can vacuum as well, and it doesn't hurt me at all. I don't sneeze either. I might sneeze once if I'm emptying the vacuum cleaner and I'm in a cloud of dust, but that's just mechanical irritation rather than being allergic. So yes, it does work, and I was an asthmatic as well. And interestingly, I wasn't an asthmatic as a 7-year-old, but then migrated to Australia from England and had vaccine fever on the ship, and they administered a jab of penicillin in my backside every day. And when I got to Australia, I had asthma. So my microbiome, I'm assuming, was disrupted. But as I take my own product every day, then that kind of reverses that situation. But it's different good bugs stuck to my Payas patches now rather than the original ones. So yeah, there's. I say, people ask me, how long have I got to take the product? When can I stop? And I say, well, it's if you can answer the question, when can I stop weeding my garden? Then you've got the answer.
Yes.
But everything happens much quicker in the gut because bacteria are doubling every, 20 minutes or so. And within 2 days of me stopping taking my product, I've got irritable bowel syndrome again.
Yes.
So I have to take it every day just to stay normal.
Mm. Yeah. Well, let's get back to basics here, because you and I, we take a lot of terms of science and the ways in which these terms are networked together, and it kind of makes sense to us. But, we're talking about microorganisms, so bacteria that are how many times smaller than a human cell? And what's the numbers? Like, there's some guesstimates that we've got 10 times more bacteria on our body than we do our own human cells.
Okay, first question first, the size. It depends which cell you're talking about, of course, because human cells can vary. There's long axons on nerve cells and things like that. But if you're talking about, say, a red blood cell, then probably the average bacterium is about a tenth or even less the length or diameter. So we're talking about something that's hundreds of times smaller. Yes, we have got a vast number of bacteria. Now, the number that everybody quoted was not 100 trillion, 90 trillion of which were bacteria in your gut. And then someone said, no, I've counted them all, and there's only 50% of your cells of bacteria. But the one thing that you've got to remember is that most of your cells in your body are red blood cells. I think it's like 2/3. Right. And they are without a nucleus, they are anucleate, and they cannot produce anything. They're just oxygen carriers. So if you eliminate them from the equation, then you're back to this 90% bacteria thing. But of course, even that is an oversimplification, because you've got a whole lot of viruses, probably a lot more viruses than you have bacteria in your gut, because all those bacteria are carrying bacteriophage, and they're viruses. And then you've got all the fungi or fungi, depending on which university you went to. And so we are just scratching the surface when it comes to understanding the microbiology of the microbiome in the gut. And of course, it's not the only microbiome. You're covered in bacteria, and they're up your nose and in your mouth and everywhere else. So in your beard,
I just saw on TV the other day, they were talking about new species that are being discovered in our oceans all the time, and for every species that we know of in our oceans, there's another 2 or 3 that are yet to be discovered.
Well, I suggest that there's a whole lot more than 2 or 3.
Yes. Yeah, and our gut would be like that. So we're talking about the bacteria that kind of, like, if people think of the human body, we're somewhat like a donut. We've got this tube, which is outside of our body from our mouth to our anus. And then that's populated because it's such a great environment. We're putting nutrients in it all the time. And so it's a great environment for microbiological life forms to exist in. So when we talk about our gut, are we talking about everything from our mouth all the way to our anus? Are we talking about just the small intestines, large intestines? Do we have bacteria also in our stomach, in the acidic environment of our stomach? Is there bacteria in there?
Yes, there are. When we talk about the gut, it usually excludes the esophagus and may or may not include the stomach, I guess. But the collective noun for all of that, of course, is the gastrointestinal tract. It's the tube, as you suggest, from your mouth to your anus. The bacteria, look, they're, in terms of numbers, there's a 1,000-fold increase, I think, from your stomach to your small intestine, another 1,000 from your small intestine to your large intestine, fold increase. And so, yes, your stomach, being a bath with concentrated hydrochloric acid in it, is designed to wipe out a lot of the bacteria that might cause problems for you. And of course, switching that off with a proton pump inhibitor like Nexium or Zantac or something like that is not necessarily a good idea. We could talk about that later if you like. But this most of the stuff happens in the large intestine, the colon, in terms of fermentation activity. But a lot of it, you see, you've got all your digestive enzymes in your saliva, particularly amylase, as you know, breaking down the starch. And then as it goes down into your stomach, you've got the acid, and you've got, after that, you've got pepsin and trypsin and chymotrypsin and all those sorts of proteolytic enzymes. So it's a combination effect of all those things plus acid hydrolysis in the stomach. And the one thing to know is that antibiotics wipes out very often the bacteria that are in your small intestine just below your stomach, a bit after your stomach. And when that happens, you create a biological vacuum, and you've wiped out the cultures that are like yogurt cultures, streptococci and lactobacilli. And then bacteria come down from the mouth in particular and take over. And if they are gas producers, then when you feed yourself, you're feeding them. And particularly if you feed them something they like the sugary foods, then they'll produce gas and you'll have bloating and gastric reflux. And of course, instead of just switching off the stomach acid, which is, as a frontline defense, I can understand why it's done. You don't want acid going up your esophagus because you end up with Barrett's esophagus, all sorts of problems. But it's better to suppress the bad bacteria that are in the small intestine to stop all that happening.
Yes.
And that's the role of the probiotic.
So we're born, and the bacteria that kind of constitute our gut, as you said, comes from the vaginal canal, comes from breastfeeding, anything else that the baby might suck on during that first, 10 to 12 months of life?
That's right.
And then that's the kind of gut microbiome that our immune system tolerates. And then at some point we get sick and we take an antibiotic, penicillin or some derivative of that. And that is like an atomic bomb going off in our gut, and it leaves a bit of a desert.
Yeah.
And then you're saying opportunistic bacteria from the food that we eat. But what about the bacteria from lower down in our GI tract? Can they migrate up?
They come up that way too, but the major ones are the oral bacteria. And of course, this then has implications for heart disease. We know that if you've got bad gums, for example, you're more likely to have heart disease, and that's because Orthomonas gingivalis is a major cause of heart disease, and that's what causes gingivitis. So we know that, but also if those bacteria are taking up residence further down, and the top 3 bacteria that cause heart disease are all oral bacteria. If they're down there in your gut and perhaps are proteolytic and damaging the lining of the gut and getting into your bloodstream and lodging in your arteries and causing damage, that's, and then the body tries to pump in cholesterol to heal the damage. And, then you can get bleeding as these bacteria transport into the lining. And there are bacteria like chlamydia pneumoniae that will actually hijack, I think it's that one, that hijacks white blood cells and pushes them into the lining and causes bleeding, which causes the clot, which causes the blocking of the artery. And
how commonly is this understood, particularly amongst the medical fraternity, that heart disease is a bacterial infection?
I don't know. You'd have to ask the heart specialists, I suppose.
Yeah.
I'd be very surprised if they didn't know it.
Yeah.
Because that information has been around for a long time.
Yes.
I remember back in the, or probably the 1980s, in a dairy congress, they were talking about A2 milk. And I made the point that heart disease is an infection, back then it was known, but how generally it's known. I think you have to also appreciate the fact that medical practitioners are that what they do is laid down by the medical board, and they can't transgress, or if they do, they're at risk of being deregistered or being sued because they didn't stay within the box. Mm-hmm. So, and and the guidelines that are laid down take a long while to mature and be introduced, and so the actual guidelines that are laid down are probably 20 years behind. I don't know, yes, but 20 years behind the research.
Yeah. Even just with diabetes, the Australian Diabetes Association only started advocating a low carbohydrate diet in 2018.
Yes.
That was just yesterday. And it's like we've known that, sugar's the culprit, and have known that for a long time.
And also doctors will tell you to have margarine instead of butter when it's in the 1970s, when I was the microbiologist for Dairy Farmers Cooperative, and I was aware of a paper where they put first heart attack patients, divided them into two groups, put one on a butter diet and one on a margarine diet, and the margarine diet had twice as many heart attacks as the butter diet.
Wow.
Twice as many second heart attacks. And so it's been known since then, and all naturopaths will tell you to have butter instead of margarine. I've never changed to margarine. I think it's toxic. But the doctors are still saying, as far as I know, that margarine is what you're supposed to have. And the low-fat diets, and it's all right to have a yogurt that's low-fat but full of sugar. Yes. That sort of thing. It takes a while. It takes a while for all these myths to be overturned.
Now, that's not also to say that doesn't give people a license to go eat exorbitant amounts of fat, which, by the way, is a trend with this whole keto view, and people are just going really high in their fat calories. Now, just so for everyone else's benefit, if you're going to lose weight, you have to decrease total caloric intake, right? So if you're loading up your diet with a lot of fat, then you've got to sacrifice calories from other macronutrients such as protein. Obviously, you'll restrict carbohydrates, but then you sacrifice too much protein if you're going to load up 70% of your calories from fat. Now, I have seen speaking of the gut microbiome, I have seen some evidence that suggests the high-fat diet, that dietary approach, can be detrimental to the gut microbiome. It doesn't tend to bode well long-term. Have you read any of that data?
Well, one thing I will say is a friend of mine who was overweight used to go on to that high-fat, high-protein, low-carb diet, and he had to have his intestine removed because it was full of a substance that was described as concrete. So, yeah, you've got to wonder whether that was because of the diet he was on.
Yeah. Look, when I move people through to the stabilization, then, because I restrict both carbohydrates and fat. Right. People have enough of their own fat to churn through first. But once we get to their ideal body weight, then in the stabilization phase, then I think about 30% of total calories is from fat. And we're talking about olive oils, avocado oils, fish oils, etc. A little bit of butter as well. It's not that. And they did the study where they kept people who have had their weight stable for a long period of time, and they kept their total protein and carbohydrate intake the same, and they just started to gradually increase the fat calories all the way up to a total daily caloric intake of 6,800 calories a day.
Wow.
And they didn't gain weight.
Wow.
So now, had they start increasing the amount of carbohydrates and further stimulating insulin, then they'd start depositing that fat onto their own hips and tummy, right? But so you're also talking about the oral microbiome. I was at a medical conference a couple of years ago now in the US, and I listened to this guy talking about some of the cardiovascular benefits of tongue scraping.
Yeah, right.
And he was saying that when you scrape your tongue, it increases some bacteria. I can't even remember which ones, you know the names of all these bugs, that improved nitric oxide production that was beneficial for heart health. But if you scraped your tongue and used a particular kind of mouthwash that I think contained chlorhexidine or something like that, then it blunted the beneficial effects of the tongue scraping.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so complicated. I think that's what I want people to understand. And given how complicated it is, then what's your view on, I hear people saying, oh, you don't need a probiotic. You just need to eat good food, and you need bacterial diversity from all these other fermented products. What's your take on all of that?
Well, if you've got a very good and diverse microbiome, then the diet will have a big effect on the balance of those microorganisms and ultimately on your health. But if there are a lot of people who've got such a depleted and biased microbiome that, and I'm assuming this is the reason they like this, that they can't eat a good diet. I mean, there's one professor, Jordan Peterson. You may have heard of Jordan Peterson. He's a psychologist, clinical psychologist. He cannot eat vegetables. He has to eat just meat. Otherwise, he is very, very unwell. And his daughter's the same. So it's now coming out that what we call a good, quote unquote, diet is not necessarily good for everybody. And that's perhaps a function of genetics. It's a function of the bacteria that are in the gut and so on. But I look at it this way: if you've got a depleted microbiome, nothing that you do in terms of good food is likely. You can't introduce good bacteria once they're gone, and so the diet is being acted on by the bacteria that you've got in your gut, and they're producing all sorts of compounds that are having an impact on your health. But even a good diet, so-called, is not going to be good for a person necessarily who's got weird bugs down there that are doing all sorts of bad things to, and all you're doing is feeding those bugs with those foods. So it has to be a suck it and see exercise, I think, with various people to see what sort of foods their microbiome will accept, and it's the combination of the bacteria and the food that give you the outcome. And if you haven't got the bacteria there, then no amount of good diet is necessarily going to produce nirvana. For you. So that's my opinion.
And I mean, you could eat all these various fermented foods, yogurts and kimchis and all this sort of stuff, but you don't know what's in them. You don't know how much of what bugs and what's beneficial and what's not, and not all of them are going to be beneficial.
Well, that's right, and that prompts me to bring up a chart that I've got here. Of course, it's in reverse because of the way the camera's operating, but these are all probiotic, so-called, that were available in the Australian market, and this was all done by the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries, so it's a reputable thing, and they're testing the effect on E. coli of extracts from all of these probiotics. And if you can see that chart there, you can see that if there's no effect on the growth rate, it's on that line. But what you've got is the ones we use are producing about a 40% suppression of the bad bug. But look at all these others. They're all lined up in order of effectiveness. A third of them are actually stimulating the bad bug, even though lots of those are called lactobacillus acidophilus. Right. So I always call that chart oil stained oils.
Yes.
You can't tell by getting looking at the label on a probiotic product, whether it's got a good, say, lactobacillus acidophilus in it or a bad one. You just don't know. It's like saying, you know, John Smith, he's a good bloke, isn't he? Well, he might be a murderer as far as you know.
Yes.
The one that you know is different to the one I know. So, yeah, the regulations are yet to catch up to the science. At the moment, of course, they're all GRAS status, generally regarded as safe. When if you could take enough of those bad ones, they're probably going to do you a lot of harm. So the regulations have to catch up to the
I mean, it wasn't that long ago. I read something where they had a bunch of people who were taking probiotics and they had ill health issues. And that's one of the primary reasons why they were taking the various probiotics that they were taking. And then they removed the probiotics from their daily consumption, and 70% of them, their symptoms improved.
Yeah. Well,
So it was right.
Yeah.
So I'm of the view, I'm like you. I like the product that you manufacture because it gets, you've got the right strains, I believe, and you can get them into the gut in the right numbers. Now, what are the right numbers? Do we need trillions?
Yeah, well, if you've got dysbiosis and you've got 90 trillion bacteria down there, then there's going to be tens of trillions of bad, quote unquote, ones. And that's, you know, good and bad are oversimplifications, but, you know, that'll do for this conversation. And so you're going to need trillions to have an impact, trillions of good bacteria to have an impact. And so we start out with 30 billion, or in one of our products, plus product, it's 50 billion. And we're getting, with the boost effect of the combinations of several different prebiotics, we're getting a boost effect that CSIRO experiments extrapolating from that pig experiment that they did. It's possible that we're getting anything from 50 to 200-fold increases in the numbers. We're supplying it as a powder, which then rehydrates in a glass of water, doesn't need to suck in stomach acid like a capsule does. And so you get much higher survival rates, presumably, through the stomach acid. And so when you combine all these things, you've got a much greater chance of, there's somebody ringing my phone, but I'll just hang up. You've got a much greater chance of getting high enough numbers to have an impact on that dysbiosis.
And even that, you got to take it every day, right? Because those bugs, we haven't got a tolerance to anything new. As John said earlier, there's like, you know, there's tolerance up to about 10 months of age. And then beyond that, your immune system's going to wipe out anything new, and you want your body to be doing that. But we live in a post-antibiotic era, and which is a necessary evil. You know, if we didn't have antibiotics, then we wouldn't be here.
Antibiotics, but I'm against using them for anything and everything where you're going to survive without them.
Well, for a long time, they were related to as somewhat inert, right? They help people get better, but if it was going to have somewhat of a placebo effect, the doctor could prescribe them and they did no harm.
That's right.
But then, you know, as you're saying, it messes with our gut to the degree where it influences our immune system, our physiology. And I think maybe in another podcast, I'd love to introduce you to for a chat together with Eric, who does a lot of neuro rehabilitation work here in Sydney, and then also our consulting neurobiologist, Kristen, who's in Los Angeles. And let's tease out a little bit further the relationship between the gut microbiome and how the brain functions. Is there data today? Do we know, is there sort of really strong correlative links connecting the use of antibiotics with depression?
Whether there's a direct identified link, and I suspect the link is there because we have people who are depressed who take our product and they feel a whole lot happier. So there's definitely a link with everybody knows that the microbiome is affecting brain function. And, 70 or 80% of your neurotransmitters are produced by bacteria in your gut. So everybody, when I say everybody, those in the area know that that is the case, that the microbiome is important. And I mean, I've got anecdotal evidence that you can reverse what do you call it, when they're agitated and anxiety. You can reverse that. But also, with our products, our formula, the Department of Defence has run a trial trying to improve the cognitive ability of soldiers, and they're using fit young people. And I said to my son, Jonathan, this is not going to work. How could it possibly? But apparently it has. And It hasn't been published yet. But now they've connected to St Vincent's in Melbourne, and that hospital wants to do a 2-year trial on recovery post-operation, the effect of probiotics on that. So, the word's getting out, and it's just very slow.
Yes.
That's all. But, I mean, you can get into the area of autism. I mean, that's one of my favourite subjects. And
what's known? Share with us what's known.
What is known is that a lot of autistic kids have got high levels of neurotoxin producing bacteria like Clostridia. And the original work that uncovered this involved a woman called Ellen Bolte, who had a son. Her son was autistic. And it was found that a lot of kids who are autistic have got antibodies in their system circulating that are against the neurotoxin produced by Clostridium tetani, so the tetanus causing bug. And now how that is getting to the brain, it is known that the blood-brain barrier is controlled by gut bacteria, and presumably it's coming through the blood. But also you've got the vagus nerve is releasing chemical signals into the brain. So there's that gut-brain connection that everyone's aware of. But autistic kids have got a range of Clostridia in their gut, and 25% of them have gut issues. So it's highly likely that what's happening is that I'll quote a Russian woman who is an immunologist in Harley Street, and she says that it's becoming a generational thing. The reason we've had this surge in recent years of autism is that grandma had antibiotics, and of course Clostridial spores are not affected by antibiotics, and so that tended to bias her gut microbiome and her vaginal microbiome towards having higher levels of these Clostridia. And then the next generation, she passed that microbiome on, and then that mother then had antibiotics, and it further biased it. And then when the baby came down the birth canal, the third generation picked up a high level of these Clostridia. And so it's got basically a dud microbiome. And the immune system has assumed that because mum reached childbearing age, that microbiome must be a good set of bugs. And so it protects those Clostridia. And that's why those autistic kids have got these circulating antibodies, but they're not kicking it out because the immune system is saying, hang on, this one is an original, we've got to protect it. So some Australian microbiologists actually identified 6 different Clostridia in the guts of these autistic kids, and 3 of them were totally unnamed, not the researchers, but the bugs were totally unknown. So yeah, and one bug, as a result of Ellen Bolte's work, is now called Clostridium boltei. So it is known that that's what is causing autism. It should be differentiated from perhaps a vaccine fever type reaction, which I indeed had when I was 8 years old. So there are reactions to vaccines, and I'm not saying that there isn't an effect from vaccines, but my gut feel is that it's that most of the autism, it has been caused by generations of use of antibiotics.
And what about the increased number of cesarean sections and the absence of exposure to the bacteria from the vaginal canal?
That's right.
What impact would that have?
Yeah, well, it has a big impact. Those kids that are delivered by cesarean are twice as likely to have allergies as kids that are born vaginally. And their microbiome in the early months represents a skin microbiome rather than a gut microbiome, although it does transition over a period of months to a normal gut microbiome, normal in inverted commas. The problem is that the immune system has been learning on the set of bugs that first got in there. And so there are long-term effects that are connected to the fact that that early, very early stage of the child's life, there was an aberration in the microflora in its gut. So now vaginal microflora is different in composition, but it contains the gut microbiome, microbes, if you like, and these eventually predominate, although the baby's gut microbiome, when they're vaginally delivered, resembles more a vagina than it does an adult gut. That transitions as you feed them, and of course lactoferrin in breast milk has a big effect as well. And the breastfed baby, 70 or 80% of the bugs in their gut are probiotics, but when it's weaned and totally weaned, the lactoferin's not there, the iron is not chelated and removed into the baby's bloodstream, and so bacteria that need iron, like the Clostridia and so on, predominate, and the probiotics drop to say 1 or 2% of the number there, and they're ineffective at that level, and that's a reason why we have to keep putting them in at the top end and boosting them up to high numbers. And one interesting experiment would be if the bifidobacteria are involved in handing over the intestine, for example, to the adult microflora, would that be key in resetting that whole environment? Maybe because I take my product every day and I have done for 20 years, my gut may be partially more towards a breastfed baby's gut, and perhaps that could be useful in terms of resetting the immune system. I don't know, that's just speculation on my part.
So you think there's an evolutionary kind of purpose for these fermented milk products like yogurt, etc.?
You made the point that you don't know what's in these fermented products. Now, that chart I showed you, all of those organisms presumably came from fermented foods in the first place.
Yeah.
They're not likely to have been isolated from the dirt or something like that. They're almost certainly have been isolated from kumis, kefir, whatever, yogurts, you name it. And some of those, obviously, they do the job of fermenting the milk, mare's milk or cow's milk or whatever, but they're not necessarily probiotic in their activity. So when you're eating, these kefirs and so on, how do you know that your particular set of bugs in your kefir didn't come from, well, it probably came from a dirty udder on a yak somewhere in the Tibetan highlands. And
yes,
what's in it? Who knows? You know, these products do rely on the acid that's developed to wipe out the E. coli's that are growing in there in the first place, you know. So don't drink it too early. You leave it for at least 7 days to kill off the E. coli in there, or you're going to be sick, you know.
Yeah.
So
oh, look, I'd love to get you on again, and maybe we can dig deeper into a couple of disease states. I mean, just talking about, you know, the kind of clients that I deal with, that you've supported me in helping along the way as well, many of whom are addicted to sugar, eating some, you know, and these kind of habits change. And I don't think it's just, you know, my expert coaching. I think there's like a combination of the various aspects of the approach that I use to reprogram their body and also their brain. And I think a lot of that has to do with the reconstitution of the gut microbiome. I read something not that long ago. They used fecal microbiota transplants in alcoholics. And so they wipe out their gut, clean it out as best as they can, and then they reconstitute it with the shit from a healthy person, the bugs from a healthy person. And these alcoholics just lost the urge to consume alcohol.
Exactly. I've read that too. Yeah.
And it's got addiction specialists kind of like thinking, well, what the heck have we been doing?
That's right.
You know, dealing with all of, it's all here, you know, the willpower and the psychological blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, there's a tangible reason why people find it difficult to let go of these detrimental habits.
You know, it's interesting if you get into the subject of microorganisms, parasites, whatever, that are living in another organism, how they can affect the brain of that host is quite incredible. For example, there's one parasite that lives part of its life cycle in fish and the other part of it in birds that eat fish. And what it does once it gets into the fish, gets into its brain and causes the fish to swim up to the surface where the bird can catch it. And then the bird catches it and the thing happily moves into the next stage of the life cycle. And then the bird's flying along and craps in the water and it's back in the fish again. And there's another one with a
But
snail.
hang on, isn't that beautiful? The joke of it, the joke of nature, it's like we relate to these various organisms from that parasite to a higher organism called a fish, to an even higher organism called a bird, thinking that there's an evolutionary hierarchy, but who's controlling it all is the parasite. That's right. Beautiful.
There's another one that gets into a snail and turns it into a zombie, and it crawls up the grass and the birds can find it and eat it. And that's the same situation again. And there's also a theory that toxoplasmosis, you know, Toxoplasma gondii is the bug that's prevalent in cats, and people can catch it from cats. And when it gets into a male human, it makes them more untidy.
No.
And if it gets into a female, it has the opposite effect and makes them very conscious of their appearance and things like that.
Well, women just need to be a little bit more accommodating and forgiving of men's untidiness. We may have patted a cat once upon a time.
Yeah, that's right. We always had cats from a very early age, and I'm not a cat fan, but I've had to put up with them. And so that's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it.
Isn't that fascinating? Mate, it's been great to have this chat with you. I'd love to have you on another one of these in the not too distant future. Hope everybody's enjoyed the conversation between John Ellerman and myself. Just to, again, let everyone know, John is a consulting microbiologist to Simplr Health. He's one of my scientific advisors, And it's just a real honor and a privilege for me to have you on the team. So thank you once again, mate.
No problem, Dean. Anytime.
Awesome.
Okay.
All right. Take care, man.
See you.